Family is supposed to mean safety. The mother who carries you, who feeds you, who tucks you in at night, is supposed to be the last person on earth who would ever decide that you should not be alive. She is the first face you ever see, and the one your mind reaches for when you are afraid. She is meant to be the wall between you and everything that could hurt you. But for the children in these cases, that wall was the threat. The person who was supposed to protect them was the one running the calculation, the one writing the plan, the one buying the bullets, mixing the poison, locking the door, or pressing the button. The crimes you are about to hear were not accidents. They were not breakdowns. They were decisions made by women who had time to stop and chose not to. Today we are covering 10 mothers who planned the murders of their own children, and the moments their plans came undone. Case 1. Susan Smith. On the night of October 25, 1994, a young woman in a small South Carolina town walked up to a stranger's front door and started screaming for help. She was 23 years old. Her name was Susan Smith. She lived in the town of Union, where everybody knew everybody else, and she had 2 little boys at home who depended on her for everything. Her older son Michael was 3 years old. Her younger son Alexander, who everyone called Alex, was 14 months old. They were small enough that both of them still needed car seats. They had been with her in her car earlier that evening. According to the story Susan told, they were not with her anymore. She told the people who answered the door that a man had stopped her car at a red light. She said the man got into her car, pointed a gun at her, and forced her to drive. She said the man then made her get out of the car on a dark country road and drove off with her 2 sons still strapped in the back seat. She was crying. She was shaking. She begged the homeowners to call the police. Within hours, the story of Susan Smith and her 2 missing little boys was on the local news. Within days, it was on national news. Within a week, it was a story the entire country was watching. For 9 days, Susan Smith stood in front of cameras and made tearful pleas for the safe return of her children. Her husband David Smith stood next to her. They were separated at the time, but appeared together for the press conferences. People all across America saw her crying. Volunteers showed up in Union to help search the woods and the back roads. Strangers wrote letters and prayed. Yellow ribbons went up all over the small town. Everyone wanted to bring those 2 little boys home. But behind the scenes, the police were not entirely convinced. The story did not quite add up. Susan said her car had been stopped at a red light at an intersection on the edge of town. But that particular traffic light only turned red when another car was at the cross street. There were no other cars there that night. Detectives quietly asked themselves why a person stealing a car would let the driver out but keep 2 small children. And they noticed something else. Susan's behaviour, when the cameras were not on, did not match the behaviour of a mother whose children were missing. She kept asking about a man named Tom Findley. Tom Findley was the son of the man who owned the textile mill where Susan worked. He came from one of the wealthiest families in town. He was handsome, single, and considered one of the most desirable men in Union. Susan had been seeing him. About a week before the children went missing, Tom had written her a letter ending the relationship. In the letter, he was kind, but he was also clear. He told her she was a wonderful person, but he was not ready to be a father. He did not want the responsibility of raising another man's children. He wanted out. Susan kept that letter. The police would later find it. And as the days passed, investigators became more and more convinced that the carjacker did not exist. There was no description that matched anything they could verify. There was no other witness. There was no surveillance footage. There was nothing. So the detectives began to push her, gently at first, and then harder. They asked her the same questions over and over. They watched her body language. They listened to the gaps in her story. On the 9th day, November 3rd, 1994, Susan Smith broke down. She wrote a confession. In it, she admitted that there had been no carjacker. She admitted that she had driven her own car, with both of her sons strapped into their car seats in the back, to a boat ramp at John D. Long Lake. She had stopped at the top of the ramp. She had put the car in neutral. She had gotten out, and she had let the car roll, slowly, down the ramp and into the water. Investigators went to the lake. Divers searched. They found the car at the bottom, exactly where she said it would be. The two little boys were still inside, still strapped into their car seats in the back, just as they had been when she left them. Later, when investigators studied how long it took the car to actually go under, they figured out something terrible. The car did not sink right away. It floated on the surface for about 6 minutes before water filled it up enough to drag it down. That meant Michael and Alex were alive in that car for several minutes after Susan walked away. She did not look back. She did not change her mind. She walked up the hill to the top of the ramp and started walking down the road, and she never turned around to save them. The reaction in Union was something the town had never experienced before. The same neighbours who had been searching for the boys, the same volunteers who had brought food to David Smith and Susan's family, the same strangers who had cried watching her on television, all of them now had to absorb the truth. The mother had done it. There was no kidnapper. The story she had told for 9 days, while everyone in the country was looking for her sons, was a lie she had used to cover up what she had already done. The case became one of the most watched trials of the 1990s. The prosecution, led by a young attorney named Tommy Pope, argued that Susan Smith was not insane and not out of her mind. They argued she was selfish. They argued she had done the math in her head and decided that 2 small children were the only thing standing between her and the life she wanted with Tom Findlay. Tom had said in his letter that he did not want her kids, so she got rid of her kids. The prosecution asked the jury to consider the death penalty. The defence argued that Susan was deeply depressed. Her father had died by suicide when she was 6 years old. Her stepfather, according to court records, had been physically abusive toward her and had committed acts of sexual mistreatment against her when she was a teenager. She had attempted to take her own life more than once before, including as a young teenager. Her lawyers argued that on the night of the crime, she had driven to the lake intending to kill herself along with her children, but at the last second, she could not go through with it. They asked the jury for mercy. It took the jury only 2.5 hours to find her guilty of 2 counts of murder. But when it came time to decide whether she should die for it, the jury could not agree on death. Some of them believed her depression was real. Some of them could not bring themselves to send a woman to the death chamber for what was clearly a deeply broken life. So they gave her life in prison instead. The judge sentenced her to 2 concurrent life sentences, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. That meant she would not even be considered for release until November 2024. In prison, Susan Smith did not have what anyone would call a clean record. Over the years, 2 prison guards were fired after admitting to having relationships with her. She was moved between facilities. She got into trouble. She tested positive for drug use behind bars. She wrote letters that were sometimes published, including one in which she described the night of the killings, and admitted that when she reached the top of the hill above the lake, she stopped, looked back, and saw nothing but a dark lake. She wrote that nobody would have ever guessed that 2 little boys had just drowned at their mother's hand. In November 2024, exactly 30 years after the murders, Susan Smith had her first parole hearing. She appeared by video link from prison. She was 53 years old by then. She cried. She said she knew what she did was horrible. She said she would give anything to go back and change it. She said she loved Michael and Alex with all her heart. The parole board listened. Then they listened to David Smith, the boy's father, who showed up wearing a pin with photos of his 2 sons. He told the board that God had given Susan free choice, and she had used that choice to end his children's lives. The board voted unanimously to deny her parole. Under South Carolina law, she becomes eligible to ask again every 2 years. Susan Smith remains incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. Michael would have turned 33 in 2024. Alexander would have turned 31. They would have grown up. They would have had birthdays, school graduations, jobs, maybe families of their own. None of that exists for them. None of it ever will. They were 2 small boys, asleep in their car seats, on a full night in 1994. Their mother walked them down to the edge of a lake and walked away. That is the entire story. And it is also a story that will never have an ending, because the people who would have lived the rest of it are not here to live it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Susan Smith chose a man over her children. The next mother on this list made a similar calculation, but the man she was trying to win back was not a wealthy bachelor. He was a married man who had told her, in plain words, that her kids were the problem. Case 2. Diane Downs. It was just before 10:30 at night on May 19th, 1983. A woman drove a small red car into the emergency entrance of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. She was honking the horn over and over. Hospital staff ran out and saw a sight that none of them would forget. 3 small children were in the back seat, all of them with serious wounds. The mother had been shot too, in her left forearm. She was crying. She kept telling the staff that a strange man had attacked them on a country road. Her name was Diane Downs. She was 27 years old. She worked as a letter carrier for the United States Postal Service. Her 3 kids were Christy Ann, who was 8, Cheryl Lynn, who was 7, and Stephen Daniel, who everyone called Danny, who was 3. Within minutes of arriving at the hospital, Cheryl was pronounced dead. Christy had been hit in a way that caused a stroke. She lost the ability to speak and move parts of her body. Danny had been hit in the spine. He was paralysed from the waist down. He was 3 years old. He would never walk again. Diane gave a clear account to the police. She said she had been driving home from a friend's house with her 3 children in the car. She said she was on Old Mohawk Road, a quiet rural road outside Springfield, when a man in the road waved her down like he needed help. She said she stopped. She said the man came up to her window and tried to take her car. She said when she resisted, he shot her in the arm, then opened the back door and shot her 3 children. She said she had thrown her car keys into the bushes to distract him, and while he searched for them, she got back into the car and drove for help. It was a story that should have made the entire state of Oregon afraid, but almost from the first moment she told it, the people listening to her had a problem with it. The doctors and nurses at the hospital were the first to notice. Diane was not behaving like a mother whose children had just been hurt. She was calm. She was almost too calm. She was joking with staff. She asked at one point if her car had blood on the seats because she did not want it to be ruined. She made comments that struck people as strange given what had just happened. One of the first phone calls she made from the hospital was not to her parents or to her ex-husband. It was to a man named Robert Knickerbocker. To understand what investigators believed had happened on that road, you have to understand who Robert Knickerbocker was. He was a married man. He worked at the same post office in Chandler, Arizona, where Diane had worked before she moved to Oregon. The 2 of them had started a relationship while she was still in Arizona. Diane had moved to Oregon only a few weeks before the night of the shooting. She was hoping that he would leave his wife and come to live with her, but Robert had told her, in clear words, that he was not interested in becoming a father. He did not want to take on 3 children. He had said that the relationship could not work because of her kids. After the move to Oregon, Diane had kept calling him. She had kept writing him letters. She had kept hoping. He had kept saying no, and one of the main reasons he kept giving was the kids. Police got hold of those letters. They got hold of her diary. In the diary, Diane wrote about Robert constantly. She wrote about the future she wanted with him. She wrote about how her kids were standing between her and the life she imagined. The diary became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case because it gave investigators something they often do not have. It gave them a written record of the thoughts that were going through her mind in the weeks leading up to the night on Old Mohawk Road. The forensic evidence did not match what Diane had said. There was almost no blood spatter on the driver's side of the car, which there should have been if a man had been standing at the window when the shots were fired. There was no gunpowder residue where it should have been. The pattern of the wounds in the car, where the children were sitting and how they were positioned, did not fit her version of events. Investigators believed that Diane had stopped the car herself, gotten out, opened the back door, and fired the shots into the back seat. They believed she had then shot herself in the arm to make the story look real, and driven slowly to the hospital, taking enough time on the way that her children were in the back seat for far longer than they should have been. The slow drive was something the police flagged early. Witnesses had seen a small red car driving along the road that night at a speed that did not make sense for a mother whose children were all hurt in the back. She drove slowly. She did not run lights. She did not flag down other drivers. The hospital was less than 10 minutes from where she said the attack happened, but it took her much longer to get there. The bullets pulled from Cheryl, Christy and Danny were .22 caliber bullets. Investigators searched Diane's house and found shell casings in a box that had identical markings. Ballistics experts later testified that the markings on the casings matched the markings on the bullets pulled from the children. The gun itself was never found, but Diane had owned a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic pistol. After the night of the shooting, that gun was gone. She said she had no idea where it was. For 9 months, the investigation continued while Diane stayed free. She gave television interviews. She acted strange in front of the cameras. She laughed. She smiled. She did not act like a grieving mother. The public watched her, and so did the police. By February 1984, prosecutors had enough. They arrested her and charged her with 1 count of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of criminal assault. When Diane Downs walked into court on May 8, 1984, the courtroom went quiet. She was visibly pregnant. She had become pregnant sometime after the shooting, and she carried the baby through the trial. People who watched her in court were stunned that she could sit there day after day while the evidence against her was laid out, while pregnant with another child. The lead prosecutor was a Lane County attorney named Fred Hughey. He told the jury that Diane had shot her children for one reason. She wanted to be free for Robert Knickerbocker. She had decided that her 3 children were the obstacle, and she had removed the obstacle. He pointed to the diary. He pointed to the letters. He pointed to the forensic evidence. He pointed to the strange behaviour in the hospital and at the press conferences. And then he called his most important witness. Christy Downs had survived. By the time of the trial, she had recovered enough to speak, though she had a permanent speech impairment. She climbed into the witness box. The prosecutor asked her, in plain words, who shot her. Christy answered. She said it had been her mum. The courtroom heard a young child say that her own mother had been the one with the gun on the night their family was destroyed. There was no man in the road. There never had been. Diane took the stand in her own defence. She stuck to her story. She said the bushy-haired stranger had done it. She showed almost no emotion when she talked about Cheryl. The jury watched her closely. They listened to the psychiatric experts the prosecution called, who described Diane as having serious personality disorders. One expert said she viewed her children not as people but as objects, as parts of her own life that she could keep or discard, depending on how they served her. On June 17, 1984, after a trial that lasted about 6 weeks, the jury found Diane Downs guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. Most of the sentence was structured to run consecutively, which meant that the judge wanted to make sure she would never realistically be released. Just 10 days after her conviction, she gave birth to a baby girl in custody. The baby was placed for adoption and was renamed Rebecca Babcock. Years later, that daughter would speak publicly about how she felt about her biological mother. She called her a monster. Diane Downs is also one of the only convicted child killers in American history to break out of prison. On July 11, 1987, 3 years into her sentence, she climbed an 18-foot razor wire fence in broad daylight at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center in Salem. The prison was short on staff that day. By the time anyone noticed she was gone, she had vanished. For 10 days, a search that crossed multiple states tried to find her. Fred Hughey, the prosecutor who had put her away, was terrified for one specific reason. By that point, he and his wife Joanne had adopted Christy and Danny. The 2 surviving children were living in the Hughey household, only 66 miles from the prison. Hughey believed that the first thing Diane would do, if she was free, was come for them. He was not wrong to think it. The 1987 escape ended when she was captured at a house less than a mile from the prison, where she had been hiding with the help of another inmate's husband. After the escape, Hughey pushed hard to have her moved out of Oregon entirely. She was transferred first to a prison in New Jersey, then later to California. She has been incarcerated in Chowchilla, California, for most of the years since. She has now been in prison for over 40 years. She has been denied parole every single time she has applied. The first hearing was in 2008. The most recent denial came in December 2025, the fourth time the parole board has told her she will not be released. In every parole hearing, Diane has maintained the same story. She still says she did not shoot her children. She has changed details over the years. The bushy-haired stranger has sometimes become two men in ski masks. The motive has sometimes become drug dealers, sometimes corrupt police. But the central claim is always the same. She insists she is innocent. The Oregon Parole Board has rejected this every time. Psychiatric evaluations have repeatedly concluded that Diane shows no real understanding of what she did, no genuine remorse, and no insight into her own behaviour. Her two surviving children grew up in a different home, with different parents who loved them. Christy has lived a quiet adult life. She got married, she had a son. She also had a daughter, who she named Cheryl Lynn, after the sister who did not survive that night on Old Mohawk Road. Danny remains paralysed and uses a wheelchair. He has built his own life as well. Both of them cut off all contact with their biological mother decades ago. They do not speak to her. They do not write to her. As far as they are concerned, the woman who was supposed to protect them on the night of May 19, 1983, ended that role for herself when she pulled the trigger. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Diane Downs used a gun. The gun was loud and the wounds were obvious, and the lies she told fell apart within days because the physical evidence was easy to test. The next mother on this list took a slower path. She did not need a moment of violence to end a life. She needed something invisible, something that could be slipped into food and drink for months at a time, something that would make doctors think the victim was simply sick. Her weapon of choice was a poison that had been used in murder cases for hundreds of years. Case 3. Marie Hilley. In May 1975, a man named Frank Hilley died in a hospital in Anniston, Alabama. He was 45 years old. He had been sick for months. His symptoms had not made sense to anyone. He had been throwing up. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. He had numbness in his arms and legs. His muscles had been twitching. Doctors had run tests. They had checked him for a long list of illnesses. In the end, when his organs began to fail, they wrote down the cause of death as infectious hepatitis. His widow, a 41-year-old woman named Audrey Marie Hilley, who everyone called Marie, collected the life insurance money. The amount was $31,140, which was a meaningful sum of money in 1975. She spent it. Nobody at the hospital had thought to test Frank Hilley for poison. There was no reason to. He was a quiet man who worked at a foundry. He had a wife and 2 children and no enemies. He had served in the United States Navy. He had been the kind of husband who sent every paycheck home so his wife could pay the bills. The idea that someone might have been doing this to him on purpose did not enter anyone's mind. It would take 4 more years before that question got asked. By then, Marie Hilley would already be working on her next victim, her own daughter. Marie Hilley had grown up in Anniston, in the same small Alabama town where she would eventually be arrested. Her parents worked in a textile mill. The family did not have much money. Marie spent her childhood looking at the wealthier families in town and wanting that life for herself. She was smart, she was sharp, she was good at making people like her. But the trait that defined her, even when she was young, was the way she handled money. She spent it the moment it came in. She did not save. She did not budget. If she had $1, she found a way to turn it into something she did not need. She met Frank Hilley when she was in 7th grade. He was 4 years older. They started dating in high school. When Frank joined the Navy, he wrote her letters from a base in Guam. He sent her his paychecks so she could put them in the bank. She did not put them in the bank. By the time he came home from the service, the money was gone. They got married anyway, on May 8, 1951. Marie was 17. Their first child, Michael, came along the next year. Their daughter Carol was born in 1960. For years, the Hilleys looked like a normal middle-class family. Frank worked steady hours as a foreman at the foundry. Marie worked as a secretary. They had a house. They had 2 kids. The neighbours saw them at church. They saw them at the supermarket. They thought of them as decent, ordinary people. What the neighbours did not see was the constant fighting about money. Marie was always overspending. The bills were always behind. There were times when the family could not pay for basic things because Marie had bought something expensive. The pressure on the marriage built up year after year. In the summer of 1974, Frank started feeling sick. It was not dramatic at first. He had stomach pain. He felt nauseous. He lost his appetite. He went to the doctor. The doctor could not find anything specific. Frank tried to push through. He kept going to work. But the symptoms came back. Then they got worse. By early 1975, he was throwing up regularly. He was losing weight. His arms and legs were going numb. His muscles were twitching uncontrollably. Through all of this, Marie was the loving wife at his bedside. She was the one who took care of him at home. She was the one who fed him. She was the one who, when he was hospitalized, brought him drinks and meals from outside. She told the family that she was helping. She was, in fact, doing exactly what she said. She was helping. She was helping the arsenic she was feeding him do its work. On May 19, 1975, Frank went to the doctor for what he thought was a bad stomach bug. By May 23rd, he was admitted to the hospital. By the early hours of May 25th, he was dead. The autopsy noted swelling in his organs, including his stomach, kidneys, and lungs. They found inflammation. They wrote it up as hepatitis. They never tested for heavy metals. There was no reason in their minds to look for poison. Marie collected the insurance money and spent it. She bought a car. She bought a motorcycle. She bought furniture. She wrote checks she could not cover. She started racking up financial trouble that would eventually catch up with her in a different way. But for the next 4 years, the death of Frank Hilley was just a sad story about a man whose body had given up too soon. Nobody connected it to her. Nobody had any reason to. The next phase started on July 27, 1978. On that day, Marie Hilley walked into the office of Liberty National Life Insurance Company and took out a policy on her daughter, Carol. Carol was 18 years old at the time. She was a young woman, healthy, just starting her adult life. The policy Marie took out had a face value of $25,000. It also had a $25,000 accidental death rider, which would pay out double if Carol died in an accident. Marie listed herself as the only beneficiary. The investigators who later worked the case would say something simple about that policy. Parents almost never take out life insurance on their adult children. The whole reason life insurance exists is that people expect their children to outlive them. When a parent buys a policy on a healthy young child, especially with an accidental death rider that doubles the payout, investigators look at it the same way they look at a loaded gun on a kitchen table. It tells you something about what the person buying it might be planning. About 8 months after the policy went into effect, Carol Hilley got sick. The first symptoms came in April 1979. She had severe nausea. She was throwing up. She felt weak. The symptoms were not constant at first. They came and went. Doctors could not figure out what was wrong with her. They sent her to specialists. They ran tests. Nothing came up. Between April and August of 1979, Carol was admitted to the emergency room and the hospital several times. Her mother was always there. Her mother was always the one taking care of her. Her mother was always the one bringing her things to eat and drink. In August 1979, Marie did something that would later turn out to be one of the most important moves in the case. She started giving Carol injections. She told the family the injections were to help with the nausea. She told the hospital staff nothing. The injections were not prescribed by any doctor. Marie was not a nurse. She had no medical training. She just took a needle, filled it with something, and put it into her own daughter's hip. Carol later described the substance as something cloudy and white-looking. Right after these injections began, Carol's symptoms changed in a serious way. The nausea stayed, but now she also had numbness in her fingers. Her legs began to lose strength. She had to be admitted to a hospital in Anniston on August 22, 1979, where Dr. Warren Sorrell tried to figure out what was wrong with her. He could not. By August 29th, he was so stuck on her case that he sent her to a bigger hospital, hoping a different team of doctors might find an answer. This is where Marie Hilley made her first real mistake. By this point, her son Michael, who was 27 and lived in Florida, had come back to Anniston to deal with a different problem. Marie had been overspending again. She had been writing bad checks all over town. The financial situation was a disaster. Michael came home to confront her about it. While he was at the house, Marie cooked him breakfast. By later that morning, he was sick. He had stomach pain. He felt nauseous. The symptoms were familiar to him. They were the same symptoms his father had been having before he died, and the same symptoms his sister had been having now. Michael recovered after he left the house. He thought about it on the plane back to Florida. The pieces started fitting together in a way he did not want to think about. He called the hospital where Carol was being treated. He asked them about the injections their mother had been giving Carol. The hospital staff told him something that shook him. They had never authorized any injections. Marie had been doing it on her own. Michael called the Anniston Police Department. He told them what he was thinking. The police already had Marie on their radar, but for a different reason. She had been arrested on September 20th, 1979, on charges of writing bad checks. The two investigations now started running side by side. While Marie sat in the city jail on the check charges, the hospital ran a new round of tests on Carol. They tested her blood for heavy metals. The results came back with arsenic levels so high that there was no normal way her body could have gotten there. On October 6, 1979, Frank Hilley's sister, Frida Adcock, went to her own mother's house, where Marie had been keeping some of her belongings. In an open cosmetic case, Frida found a small medicine bottle. She did not know what was in it. She handed it over to the Anniston police. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences tested it. It contained arsenic. 3 days later, on October 9, 1979, while Marie was still in jail on the check charges, the police arrested her again. This time, the charge was the attempted murder of her daughter. They searched her purse. They found another medicine vial inside. That one tested positive for arsenic too. A few weeks later, on October 21st, Frida Adcock went looking for more evidence in a basement where Marie had stored items during one of her many moves. She found a bottle of Cowley's rat and mouse poison. The lab tested it. It was a 1.4 to 1.5% solution of arsenic. The bottle was plenty strong enough to slowly take a person apart over a period of months. On October 25th, a grand jury in Calhoun County indicted Marie for the attempted murder of Carol. The investigators knew what they had to do next. They got a court order to dig up Frank Hilley's body. The autopsy that had labelled his death as hepatitis 4 years earlier had never tested for poison. This time the lab looked for heavy metals. Frank's body contained arsenic levels that were 10 to 100 times higher than normal. Forensic scientists could even tell from the chemistry that he had been getting smaller doses over a period of months, which is what slowly destroyed his organs and produced the symptoms doctors had mistaken for hepatitis. On January 11, 1980, a grand jury indicted Marie for his murder. By that time, however, Marie was gone. After her arrest in October 1979, her bail had been set, and on November 9, 1979, her attorney had posted it. She had been released to wait for trial at a motel in Birmingham. On November 16th, she vanished. She left a note suggesting she had been kidnapped. She had not been kidnapped. She had stolen a car from her aunt and uncle's house, abandoned it in Georgia, and gone to Florida. She would spend the next 3 years living under fake names. In Florida, she met a man named John Homan. She told him her name was Robbie Hannon. They got married in May 1981 in New Hampshire. Then she pulled off something almost no fugitive ever does. She faked her own death. She told John that she had to travel to Texas alone. While she was gone, she called him on the phone, pretending to be a different woman. She told him that Robbie had passed away from a sudden illness, and that she, Robbie's twin sister Terry, was now coming to Vermont to help him with the grief. There was no twin sister, there was just Marie. She moved in with John as Terry Martin. She got a secretarial job. She tried to live a quiet life. The problem was that her behaviour eventually started making people around her suspicious. Her co-workers at the new job recognised her from her old job. John's family started looking into her past. They could not find a death certificate for Robbie. They could not find an obituary. The funeral home she claimed had handled the body did not exist. By January 1983, the Vermont State Police were looking at her. When they brought her in, she gave up almost right away. She told them her real name was Audrey Marie Hilley and that she was wanted in Alabama. She was sent back to Anniston to stand trial. The trial began in June 1983. The prosecution called her own children to the stand. Carol, who had survived and who had recovered the use of her legs, testified that her mother had given her the unauthorized injections. Michael testified about the breakfast that had made him sick. Frida Adcock testified about finding the bottles. A woman named Priscilla Lang, who had shared a jail cell with Marie, testified that Marie had told her she had killed her husband by putting small doses of arsenic in his food over time. The toxicology results were laid out for the jury. The insurance policy on Carol was laid out too. The jury deliberated for under 3 hours. On June 8, 1983, they found Marie Hilley guilty of murdering Frank and attempting to murder Carol. Judge Sam Monk sentenced her to life in prison for the murder, plus 20 more years for the attempted murder of her daughter. She was sent to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. Marie Hilley would not stay there. In February 1987, after almost 4 years inside, she was granted a 3-day pass to visit John Homan, who was still standing by her. She used the pass to vanish again. For 4 days she was missing. Authorities searched. The weather turned cold and rainy. On February 26, 1987, the back porch of a house in Anniston was where they finally found her. She was barely conscious. She had been wandering through the cold rain. She had developed severe hypothermia. She was rushed to a hospital. She died on the way. The total list of people Marie Hilley is suspected of poisoning is longer than the 2 she was convicted for. Investigators came to believe that her own mother and her mother-in-law, both of whom died in suspicious circumstances within 2 years of Frank's death, had also been victims. Both of those women had arsenic in their bodies during their later autopsies. There is also the question of whether Marie poisoned other relatives and acquaintances over the years. The official conviction sticks to 2 victims. The full count, in the eyes of the investigators who worked her case, was almost certainly higher. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marie Hilley used a poison that she could buy in a hardware store and a syringe she could fill at home. She killed slowly, over months, while looking like the most loving wife and mother in the room. The next mother on this list took a different approach. She did not try to make her crimes look like a long mystery illness. She did not stage a story for the police. She simply hid the evidence in cardboard boxes in her own garage, where the bodies of 6 newborns sat for years before anyone found them. Case 4. Megan Huntsman. The town of Pleasant Grove sits about 35 miles south of Salt Lake City in Utah County. It is a quiet place. The streets are lined with modest houses. The neighbors know each other. People call it leafy. People call it sleepy. The kind of town where nothing much happens, and everyone likes it that way. On the afternoon of April 12, 2014, that sense of quiet ended for one specific block. A man named Darren West was cleaning out the garage of the house where his estranged wife had lived with their 3 daughters for years. He had just been released from federal prison after serving time on drug charges. He was trying to put his life back together. He was sorting through old boxes that had been stacked on the shelves and in the corners for what looked like years. One of the boxes was small and white, sealed shut with electrician's tape and wrapped in plastic. He opened it. Inside was the tiny body of a baby. What Darren West did next set off one of the strangest and darkest cases in the modern history of the state of Utah. He called the police. Officers from the Pleasant Grove Police Department arrived. They got a search warrant. They started going through the rest of the garage. They opened more boxes. They found 6 more bodies of newborns, each one wrapped, each one packed away the same way. 7 tiny bodies in total. All of them had been sitting in that garage, on shelves and in cabinets, hidden among Christmas ornaments and old toys and family belongings, for years. Some had been there for almost 2 decades. The mother of all 7 of those children was a 39-year-old woman named Megan Huntsman. By the time her ex-husband found the first box, she was no longer living in the Pleasant Grove house. She had moved out a few years earlier. She was at her boyfriend's mobile home park. The police drove there the following day. They brought her in for questioning. What she told them is one of the most disturbing confessions in American filicide cases, not because of the way she described her own actions, but because of how flat she was while describing them. Megan Huntsman was born on February 26, 1975, and she grew up in Pleasant Grove. She was the oldest child of an industrial painter and a mother who worked at a grocery store. The family was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, though by adulthood Megan was no longer active in the church. She went to Pleasant Grove High School, and that is where she met Darren West. The 2 of them got married in April 1993, just after she turned 18. They moved into a house owned by Darren's parents, the same house where the bodies would later be found. In the early years of the marriage, Megan had 3 daughters. Those 3 girls grew up in the same house, where their mother would later hide the bodies of their siblings. According to neighbours and family members, the 3 daughters were good kids, quiet, well-behaved. They turned out remarkably well considering everything that was going on around them. Their grandparents, the Wests, played a major role in raising them, especially the youngest. Nobody who lived nearby ever suspected that anything was wrong inside the house. The crime started in 1996, 3 years into the marriage. Over the next 10 years, Megan Huntsman gave birth to 7 more babies in that house. The pregnancies were hidden. The births took place at home. Right after each baby was born, 6 of the 7 were ended by their own mother, immediately, in the same house where her 3 living daughters were sleeping or playing in other rooms. The 7th baby was stillborn, which was later confirmed by the medical examiner. The 6 who were born alive were strangled or smothered within minutes of being delivered. After each death, Megan would wrap the body in a towel or in a piece of clothing. She would place it inside a plastic bag. She would put the plastic bag inside a cardboard box. She would seal the box. Then she would carry it out to the garage and put it on a shelf, where it sat next to old furniture, old paperwork, holiday decorations, and the everyday clutter that builds up in any family's home. There it stayed, year after year, box after box. While she made dinner for her 3 daughters in the kitchen, while the family celebrated Christmas, while Darren came and went, while neighbours dropped by. The garage became a kind of secret cemetery that sat about 30 feet from the front door of an ordinary American house. The detail that police and prosecutors kept coming back to was how she managed to do this without anybody noticing she was pregnant. The answer came in 2 parts. The first part was Megan's own physical build. She was very small in stature. She was thin enough that even a full-term pregnancy did not change her shape in a way that was obvious to people who saw her every day. Several neighbours later said they had no idea she had ever been pregnant during those years. The second part was Darren West himself. He told police, in interviews after the discovery, that he had spent most of that decade so deeply addicted to methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana that he barely knew what was happening in his own house. He admitted he had known about a couple of the pregnancies, but he said Megan had told him each time that she had miscarried. He said he never asked questions. He said he was too high to think straight. He spent much of the decade in legal trouble, and in 2006 he was convicted on federal methamphetamine charges and sent to prison. He served almost 9 years before being released in early 2014, which was why he had come back to the house in April of that year to clean out the garage. The investigators looked hard at Darren West. They wondered, the same way the public would wonder, how a man could live in the same house with a woman who had been giving birth and hiding bodies in his garage for 10 years and not know. Utah County Deputy Attorney Jared Perkins later admitted that the natural human reaction was to think there was no way Darren could have been completely in the dark. The problem was, after all the questioning and all the investigation, prosecutors could not find a single piece of evidence that contradicted his story. He was high. He was distracted. He was eventually in prison. He had no part in the deaths. DNA testing eventually confirmed he was the biological father of all 7 babies, but he was never charged. There was simply nothing to charge him with. The interview Megan Huntsman gave to Pleasant Grove Police Detective Dan Beckstrom was long and detailed. The thing that stood out most to investigators was her tone. She was unemotional. She answered questions in a flat, matter-of-fact voice. She did not cry. She did not break down. She told Beckstrom that on the day she gave birth to one of the children, she had used a hair tie to make sure the baby was no longer alive. She described the disposal in plain language, the same way a person might describe taking out the trash. The detective said later that some of what he saw and heard during that case is something he and the other officers can never unsee. Her stated reason for the killings came down to two things. First, she said she was deeply addicted to methamphetamine during that decade. She said her entire life revolved around the next high. She said she could not imagine bringing more children into the home she was running. Second, she said that even when she was not high, she was depressed. She said she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of the 3 daughters she already had. She said she did not believe she was capable of caring for any more children. In a written statement she gave to the judge later, she said that in some small way she had told herself she was helping the babies avoid the terrible life she would have given them. The judge did not accept that as a justification. What made the explanation more troubling to the people working the case was a fact about Utah law. Utah is a safe haven state. That means a parent who feels unable to care for a newborn can legally surrender that baby to a hospital, fire station, or other designated location, no questions asked, with full legal protection. Megan Huntsman could have walked any one of those babies into a building and handed it over and walked out. She could have done that 6 times. She did not. She chose, each time, to end the baby's life and place the body in a box in the garage. The safe haven option made her stated reason about not being able to care for the children fall apart. The state was offering, for free, a way out of caring for them. She did not take it. The case was charged in stages because of an issue with Utah's murder laws. The Utah murder statute had changed during the years between when the killings happened and when the bodies were found. Prosecutors could not charge her with aggravated murder because that classification did not apply to first-degree felonies the way it would today. They charged her instead with 6 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each baby who had been born alive. The 7th baby, the stillborn one, was not part of the charges since no crime had been committed in that case. Bail was set at $6 million, $1 million for each count. Megan Huntsman was held at the Utah County Jail. The case did not go to trial. In February 2015, Megan Huntsman appeared in court and pleaded guilty. Her voice broke as she said the word guilty 6 separate times, once for each child. The plea deal was structured so that prosecutors would not have to put her 3 living daughters through the trauma of a trial. The deal also locked in an outcome where parole would be almost impossible. The sentencing took place on April 20, 2015. 4th District Judge Darrell McDade told the court that in his career he thought he had seen everything until this case. He said he had not. He sentenced Megan Huntsman to 6 terms of 5 years to life in prison, 1 for each murder. He ordered 3 of those terms to be served consecutively and 3 to be served concurrently. The math on that arrangement is what determined the rest of her life. Under Utah's sentencing rules, the 3 consecutive terms meant she would not be eligible for her first parole hearing until April 2064. By that date, she would be 89 years old. Utah County Attorney Jeff Booman said in plain words after the sentencing that he did not believe she would ever be released, and that prosecutors would be shocked if she ever was. In her statement to the judge before sentencing, Megan Huntsman tried to explain herself. She said she could not give a reasonable answer for why she had been capable of doing something so bad. She said she had carried the secret for 18 years. She said that after she got off methamphetamine, she had simply moved on to alcohol, and that depression and alcohol had taken hold of her the same way drugs had. She said she had deprived her babies of the chance to live. The members of her own family who attended the hearing, including her mother and her sister, defended her. 2 of her 3 living daughters wrote letters to the court describing their mother as a loving parent. Her sister Jamie said in court that Megan was not a monster, that she was scared. None of those statements changed the outcome. The judge gave her the maximum he could give her under the structure of the plea deal. There are details in the Megan Huntsman case that have never been fully resolved, and probably never will be. On the day of her arrest, she told police there might be 8 or 9 bodies in the home, not 7. Investigators searched the house and the property carefully. They never found any others. Police later concluded she had been confused or simply guessing about the higher number, but they could not say for sure. The exact dates of each birth and each death were never established with precision. Some of the bodies had been in the garage for so long that the medical examiner could not determine the order in which they had been born or the time gaps between them. Even the question of why Megan Huntsman left her 3 living daughters alone, including the youngest who was born during the same decade as the killings, has never been answered to anyone's full satisfaction. What happened in that garage in Pleasant Grove was the longest infanticide pattern in modern Utah history. It went on for 10 years inside an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, in a community where neighbours babysat each other's children and waved hello on the sidewalk. The woman at the centre of it was so unremarkable that the people around her never thought to look twice. That is what made the case so disturbing, and that is why people in Pleasant Grove still talk about it. A garage that anybody could have opened. Boxes that anybody could have looked inside. A secret that lasted 18 years before a husband, just released from prison, decided to clean out his own home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Megan Huntsman hid her crimes by hiding the bodies. She never had to think about police officers knocking on her door because there were no missing persons reports, no investigations, no leads. The next mother on this list took the opposite approach. She spent years murdering people in plain sight, including 2 husbands, and when the police finally started closing in, she did something almost no one else has ever done. She tried to set up her own teenage daughter as the killer. Case 5. Stacy Castor. In a quiet town in upstate New York, on the morning of August 22, 2005, a woman called 911 in a panic. Her husband was locked inside their bedroom. He was not responding. She had been trying the door. She could not get him to answer. The police came. They forced the door open. Inside the bedroom, on the bed, was the body of 48-year-old David Castor. He was an air conditioning technician. He was a quiet man. He was the kind of husband who fixed things, paid bills, and worked hard. He was now dead. On the bedside table next to him sat a glass with a green liquid in it. There was also a glass of juice and a bottle of apricot brandy. Under the bed, the police found a bottle of antifreeze. The setup looked, at first glance, like one specific thing. It looked like a man who had been depressed and had ended his own life by drinking poison. The medical examiner, after the body was tested, confirmed that the cause of death was ethylene glycol poisoning. Ethylene glycol is the toxic chemical found in antifreeze. The official ruling came back as suicide. The wife who had called 911 was a 38-year-old woman named Stacy Castor. She had been married to David for about 2 years. She had 2 teenage daughters from a previous marriage, Ashley and Bree. To the people who knew her, she seemed like a regular working mother. She was outwardly composed at the funeral. She handled the paperwork. She moved on. The case looked closed. It would have stayed closed except for one detail that nobody could quite let go of. David Castor was buried in Onondaga County. His headstone sat in a cemetery plot that was right next to another grave. The grave belonged to a man named Michael Wallace. Michael Wallace had been Stacy's first husband. He was the father of her 2 daughters. He had died in January 2000 at the age of 38. The official cause of his death had been listed as a heart attack. The 2 husbands now lay side by side in the ground, by Stacy's own request. The detectives who attended David Castor's funeral noticed those 2 graves. They started asking questions. 2 husbands of the same woman, both dead before age 50, both buried next to each other. The pattern caught their attention. They went back and looked at the David Castor case with fresh eyes. They started finding things that did not match a suicide. The first problem was the glass of antifreeze on the bedside table. The fingerprints on that glass belonged to Stacy, not David. There were no fingerprints from David at all on the glass that had supposedly delivered the lethal dose. The second problem was the bottle of antifreeze under the bed. It had no fingerprints from David on it either. The third problem was something they found in the kitchen trash: a turkey baster. The baster had traces of ethylene glycol on it. It also had David Castor's DNA on it. The picture investigators started to build was this: David Castor had not poured himself a glass of antifreeze and drunk it down. Someone had used a turkey baster to force the antifreeze into him. That same person had then carried a glass of the poison into the bedroom and placed it on the table to make the scene look like a suicide. The only person who lived in the house who could have done that was Stacy. There was also the matter of David Castor's lack of motive. He was a hunter. He kept a gun under his bed. If a man like that wanted to end his own life, the gun was right there. He would not have used a slow, painful poison. The story did not make sense as a suicide. It only made sense as a murder. In the spring of 2007, investigators decided they needed to dig further. There was nothing they could do about David Castor's body, which had been buried for almost 2 years, but Michael Wallace's body was still in the ground, and they had a growing suspicion about how he had really died. 3 months before his death in 2000, Michael Wallace had complained to his doctor about feeling drunk, even though he had not been drinking. That symptom is a classic warning sign of ethylene glycol poisoning. The doctor at the time had not connected the dots. Authorities also reviewed Michael Wallace's death more carefully. When he died in 2000, his sister had asked for an autopsy because his death felt sudden and wrong to her. Stacy had refused. She told the family the doctors were sure it was a heart attack and that there was no need to dig further. The family had reluctantly let it go. Now, 7 years later, the investigators decided to undo that decision. In September 2007, Michael Wallace's body was secretly exhumed. The investigators moved carefully. They did not want Stacy to know what they were doing. They had her under quiet surveillance to make sure she did not catch on. The casket was brought to the medical examiner. The medical examiner ran a toxicology screen and looked for the specific telltale signs of ethylene glycol exposure, which include calcium oxalate crystals that form inside the kidneys when the body breaks down the poison. The crystals were there. The lab confirmed it. Michael Wallace had been poisoned with antifreeze too. 2 husbands, same poison, same wife. Stacy Castor found out about the exhumation. She panicked. The police were closing in on her, and she could see what was about to happen. She had been the only adult in the house when David died. She had been the one to refuse the autopsy on Michael. She had been the one with the fingerprints on the glass, and the only motive that made sense. She had married both men, and she had collected on the life insurance and the estates of both men. After David's death, she had even gone so far as to forge a new version of his will to remove his son from a previous marriage from inheriting anything. The walls were closing in on her, and she made a decision that turned this case into something even darker than a double poisoning. She decided to set up her own daughter to take the blame. Ashley Wallace was 19 years old in September 2007. She had just started her first day at college. Her sister Bree was 16. The 2 girls had grown up with Stacy as their mother and Stacy as their best friend. Ashley described her relationship with her mother as one of the closest in her life. On the day Ashley arrived at college, investigators came to her school. They told her, gently, that her father Michael had not died of a heart attack. He had been poisoned. They asked her if she knew anything. Ashley was upset. She was confused. The first thing she did was call her mother. She wanted to talk. She wanted to understand what was happening. Stacy told Ashley to come home. She invited her to the house in Liverpool, New York, to have a drink and talk it over. Ashley went. She and her mother drank together that evening. The next evening, Stacy invited her again. This time, Stacy handed her a drink that tasted bad. Ashley said the drink had a nasty taste to it. She said she did not want to drink it, but her mother told her to, and she trusted her mother, so she did. The drink had been mixed with crushed prescription pills, sleeping pills, painkillers. Within a short time, Ashley was unconscious. Over the next 17 hours, Stacy kept feeding Ashley more pills and more vodka. She used a teaspoon. Ashley was barely conscious, or completely unconscious through most of it. Stacy was not just trying to make Ashley pass out. She was trying to give her enough of a chemical mix that her death would look like a deliberate overdose. While her daughter lay there, Stacy sat down at the family computer and started typing. What Stacy was typing was a 750-word fake suicide note. The note was written from Ashley's perspective. In it, Ashley confessed to 2 murders. Ashley confessed to killing her father Michael back in 2000, when she would have been 12 years old. Ashley confessed to killing her stepfather David in 2005. Ashley said she could not live with the guilt anymore and was taking her own life. The note was meant to give the police the answer they had been looking for. It would close both cases. It would make Stacy the grieving mother of a troubled girl who had done terrible things and then ended her own life. Stacy would walk away clean. The plan started to fall apart for 2 reasons. The first reason was Bree, the younger sister. Bree was 16. She came home and went to check on Ashley. She found her sister motionless in bed. Bree demanded that Stacy call 911 immediately. Stacy did not want to. She tried to delay. Bree pushed her. Eventually, Stacy called for help. Ashley was rushed to the hospital. The doctors got to her in time. She was deep in a coma, but she was alive. She woke up. She started talking. When the detectives at the hospital asked Ashley about the suicide note, Ashley had no idea what they were talking about. She had not written any note. She had not tried to take her own life. She had not killed her father. She had not killed her stepfather. She told them in plain words that they needed to talk to her mother for the answers. The second reason the plan failed was the suicide note itself. When investigators searched the family computer, they found something Stacy had not counted on. The computer's hard drive contained several earlier drafts of the suicide note. The drafts had timestamps. The timestamps showed the note had been typed during hours when Ashley was at school. Ashley could not have been the author. She had not even been in the house when the document was being created. Stacy's fingerprints were on the printed copy of the note. Ashley's were not. There was one more detail that turned the suicide note into one of the cleanest pieces of evidence in the entire case. Inside the note, the word antifreeze appeared 4 times. Each of those 4 times, it was misspelled. The note spelled it as anti-free, written as if the writer had been about to type the full word and had cut themselves off. Investigators remembered something. During an earlier interview, Stacy herself had said the word anti-free out loud. She had cut herself off mid-word. When the prosecutor pointed this out at trial, Stacy admitted she had said it, but tried to explain it as a slip of the tongue. The jury did not buy it. The same misspelling appeared 4 times in a typed note. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was a fingerprint of the author, and the author was Stacy. Stacy Castor was arrested. She was charged with the murder of David Castor and the attempted murder of her own daughter Ashley. She was not formally charged for the killing of Michael Wallace, but evidence about his death was allowed at trial because it showed pattern. The prosecution was led by Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick. He laid out the case piece by piece. The fingerprints, the turkey baster, the anniversary weekend on which David had been poisoned over 4 days, the forged will, the exhumation, the suicide note, the drafts on the computer, the misspelled word, the teenage daughter who had been used as a tool because she was the only person Stacy could think of who would still be available to take the blame. Ashley Wallace took the witness stand. She told the jury what had happened. She said she did not kill her father. She said she did not kill her stepfather. She said she did not try to take her own life. She said her mother had handed her drinks and she had trusted her mother because her mother had always been her best friend. The defense tried to argue that Ashley had been the one who killed both men, that she had been a jealous and angry child, and that the suicide attempt had been her own. The jury did not believe it. The physical evidence ruled the defense out before it could land. The trial ended on February 5, 2009. The jury, made up of 10 women and 2 men, deliberated for 16 hours over 4 days. They found Stacy Castor guilty of second-degree murder for the killing of David Castor. They found her guilty of attempted second-degree murder for what she had done to Ashley. They also convicted her of forging David's will. As the verdict was read, Stacy kept her eyes closed. There was a loud gasp from the front row of the courtroom. Ashley was sitting there. She and Bree and members of both husbands' families turned to each other and held each other. After the conviction, District Attorney William Fitzpatrick spoke to reporters. He said that if there was a ceiling in terms of evil, Stacy Castor was at the ceiling. Sentencing took place in March 2009. Stacy received 25 years to life for the murder of David Castor. She received an additional 25 years for the attempted murder of Ashley. The two sentences were structured to run consecutively. The judge added more time for the will forgery. The total sentence came out to 51 1/3 years to life. The sentencing judge, Joseph Fahy, told her in open court that in 34 years working in the criminal justice system as a lawyer and a judge, he had seen serial killers and contract killers of every kind. He told her she was in a class by herself. Stacy Castor was sent to prison. She continued to maintain her innocence. She filed appeals. She kept up the same story she had told at trial, that her daughter had done it all, and that she was the one being framed. She would not get to spend much of her life behind bars. On the morning of June 11th, 2016, she was found dead in her cell. The death was investigated. Authorities ruled out suicide and foul play. The official cause of death was a heart attack. She was 48 years old, the same age her second husband David had been when she poisoned him. Her grave is no longer next to David's. After the conviction, his family had his remains moved. They did not want him spending forever next to the woman who had killed him. Ashley Wallace survived. She gave an interview to the news media after the trial. She talked about what it was like to learn that her own mother had been planning to kill her and to use her as the patsy for 2 other murders her mother had committed. Ashley said the hardest part was not the poisoning. The hardest part was the realization that the person she had trusted most in the world had been calmly typing out her death note while Ashley was unconscious in the next room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stacy Castor used a poison that mimicked a heart attack and a suicide. She got away with it for years. The next mother on this list used a different kind of weapon. Hers was inside a hospital, in plain sight of doctors and nurses, and the substance she used was something that sits on every kitchen table in the country. Case 6. Lacy Spears. For most of his short life, a little boy named Garnet Spears was famous on the internet without ever knowing it. His mother, Lacy, had been writing about him online since the day he was born. She had a Facebook page where she posted photos of him. She had a blog. She had Twitter. She had MySpace. She had a personal page where she wrote long updates about every hospital visit, every test, every illness, every brave moment. By the time Garnet was 2 years old, his mother had publicly shared the news that he had been in the hospital 23 separate times. She kept counting. She kept posting. She kept gathering followers. People online loved Lacy Spears. They saw a young single mother in her 20s raising a child who seemed to deal with one mysterious illness after another. She wrote in a way that drew people in. She asked for prayers. She shared photos of Garnet in hospital beds, hooked up to machines. She thanked her followers for their support. The community around her grew. People sent her messages. They sent her gifts. They told her she was an amazing mother. The attention came in steady, every day, every post. For Lacy, it was the air she breathed, and it had a price. The price was paid by Garnet. Garnet Paul Thompson Spears was born on December 3, 2008. From the time he was 9 months old, he had a feeding tube placed into his stomach. His mother told doctors that he could not keep food down. She told them he had reflux. She told them he had a long list of medical issues. The truth, which would not come out until much later, was that Garnet's medical history was largely a fiction, created and maintained by his own mother. Some of the conditions she said he had were not real. Some of the surgeries he went through were not necessary. The feeding tube itself, which would later become the weapon used to take his life, had been placed in his body for symptoms that doctors who reviewed the case afterward could not actually verify. To understand how the case got to the place where it ended, you have to understand the kind of life Lacy Spears built around herself. She was born in 1987 in Decatur, Alabama. She had a way of telling stories that did not always match reality. After Garnet was born, she told different people different things about who his father was. To some, she said his father was a police officer named Blake, who had died in a car accident before Garnet was born. There was no police officer named Blake. The story was made up. Garnet's actual father was a man named Chris Hill from Alabama. Lacy told Chris that the baby was not his and warned him to stay away. The death story was the version she told the world. She told it on her blog. She told it to neighbours. She told it to strangers at hospitals. Lacy moved around the country in the years after Garnet was born. She lived in Alabama, then Florida, then eventually New York. About 14 months before Garnet's death, she settled in a community in Chestnut Ridge, New York, called the Fellowship. The Fellowship was a community designed for elderly and disabled residents. The people there welcomed Lacy and her sick little boy with open arms. They brought meals, they watched Garnet sometimes. They saw a struggling young mother and they wanted to help. One of the women who knew her there said something striking after the fact. She said the Garnet she saw outside the hospital was a healthy, hungry, active child. He ate fruit off her counter when he visited. He moved around. He played. He did not look like the dying boy Lacy wrote about online. That was a pattern doctors and friends would later notice. The Garnet at home, when nobody was watching, often seemed fine. The Garnet at the hospital, when his mother was the only one with access to his feeding tube, did not. His sodium levels would spike. His symptoms would appear. He would get worse. Then sometimes, he would get better. Then it would happen again. The medical records show that this cycle had been going on for years. The end of Garnet's life began in the middle of January 2014. He was 5 years old. He was admitted to Nyack Hospital in Rockland County, New York, with vomiting and stomach problems. His sodium levels at admission were 144 milliequivalents per litre, which is at the high end of the normal range for a child his age. The normal range is 135 to 145. Within hours, his sodium levels had jumped to 182. That is not just abnormal. That is a level so high that it should not be possible for a child to reach it through normal eating or drinking. The hospital staff was alarmed. They had no medical explanation for the sudden spike. On January 19, 2014, at 10:08 in the evening, Garnet was airlifted to Westchester Medical Center for more advanced care. By the next day, doctors at Westchester were paying very close attention to Lacy Spears. The medical history she had given them about Garnet was extensive. Long lists of past hospitalizations, multiple invasive surgical procedures, including the placement of the feeding tube and the removal of his salivary glands. She described a child who had been sick all his life. The doctors compared that history with what they were seeing in front of them. The numbers did not add up. A boy with the level of medical history she described should have shown signs they were not finding, and the unexplained rise in sodium had happened on her watch. They were now thinking about something they had been trained to consider but rarely encountered. They were thinking about Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is the older name for what doctors today call factitious disorder imposed on another. It is a mental disorder in which a caregiver, almost always a parent, fakes or causes illness in a child in their care so that the caregiver can receive sympathy, attention, and praise from doctors, family, friends, and the public. The child is the tool, the attention is the goal. In serious cases, the caregiver actively makes the child sick, which is what Westchester Medical Center suspected was happening with Garnet. On January 21st, 2014, at 7:15 in the morning, the code bell went off in Garnet's hospital room. The medical staff rushed in. The boy was on his back. He was unresponsive. He was barely breathing. His eyes were dilated. His skin had turned pale grey. The doctors did everything they could. By later that morning, an EEG showed no brain activity. The paediatric intensive care units had already called Child Protective Services with their suspicions about Lacy. By Thursday, January 23, 2014, Garnet Spears was declared deceased. The official cause was acute hyponatremia, which is the medical name for an extremely high level of sodium in the blood. The high sodium had caused his brain to swell. The swelling had ended his life. The investigation moved quickly after his death. Search warrants were executed at the apartment Lacy shared with Garnet. Inside the apartment, investigators found feeding bags. The bags were the kind used to deliver formula and medicine through a stomach tube. When the bags were tested in a lab, they were found to contain enormous amounts of sodium. Each bag held the equivalent of at least 69 small salt packets. That is not flavouring, that is a lethal dose. There was no medical reason for the salt to be in those bags. There was no doctor's order for it. There was no prescription for it. There was nobody who could explain it being there except the person who had filled the bags and connected them to the child's tube. That person was Lacy Spears. Investigators also looked at her phone records and her computer. They found that on the day Garnett was lying unconscious in the hospital, Lacy had not spent the time at his bedside the way she had been telling her followers online. She had stepped away to make a phone call to a friend. The call was about a feeding bag at home. She asked the friend to go to her apartment, find the bag, and get rid of it. She told the friend not to tell anybody. The friend did not destroy the bag. The bag was eventually recovered. It was one of the bags with the heavy salt content. On her computer, investigators found internet searches that became some of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Lacy had searched for the dangers of high sodium in a child. She had looked up information about hyponatremia. She had also searched for the term suicide in a way that prosecutors would later describe as part of her thinking through what to do. She had been researching how salt affects a child's body. The defense would later try to challenge the value of these searches. The prosecution argued they showed knowledge and planning. Lacy Spears was indicted on June 17, 2014, in Westchester County. She was charged with second-degree depraved indifference murder and first-degree manslaughter. She pleaded not guilty. She had moved back to Kentucky in the months after Garnett's death. She was arrested there and brought back to New York to stand trial. The trial began in early 2015. The lead prosecutor was Westchester County Assistant District Attorney Doreen Lloyd. In her opening statement, she told the jury that Lacy Spears was not a grieving mother. She called her a calculating child killer. She told the jury that Lacy had researched, planned, and carried out the intentional poisoning of her own son with salt over a long period of time. She described the moment when Garnett was dying in the hospital, and his mother, instead of staying by his bedside, was on the phone with a friend trying to make a feeding bag disappear. The prosecution called more than 30 witnesses. They brought in the doctors who had treated Garnett and the nurses who had been in the room. They brought in the medical examiner. They brought in the police officers who had searched the apartment. They walked the jury through the timeline of the final week of his life. The defense, led by attorney Stephen Riebling, argued that there was no direct evidence anyone had ever seen Lacy actually put salt into Garnett's feeding tube. He suggested in court that Garnett may have somehow done something to his own tube, or that hospital error could be to blame. The defense did not raise Munchausen syndrome by proxy as a formal defense. Both sides had agreed before trial not to bring it up directly. The jury deliberated for about 2.5 days. On March 2, 2015, they came back with a verdict. They found Lacy Spears guilty of second-degree depraved indifference murder. She showed almost no reaction. Her family in the courtroom collapsed. The prosecution had won what most legal observers considered an extraordinarily difficult case, since Lacy had committed her crime over many years with no eyewitnesses in hospital rooms full of medical staff who had been trained to trust her. Sentencing took place on April 8, 2015. The judge, Robert Neary, did not give Lacy the maximum sentence. The maximum would have been 25 years to life. He sentenced her instead to 20 years to life. In his remarks, the judge acknowledged that Lacy suffered from a real mental disorder. He did not name it on the record, but it was widely understood that he was referring to factitious disorder imposed on another. He did not consider that disorder to be a justification for what she had done. He told the court that her actions were unfathomable in their cruelty. He said that Lacy had used her son's feeding tube as a weapon to take his life. The prosecutor, Doreen Lloyd, told the court that throughout his short life, Garnett Spears had been forced to suffer through repeated hospitalizations, unneeded surgical procedures, and ultimately, the poisoning that killed him, all at the hands of the one person who should have been his ultimate protector. That person was his mother. Lacy Spears appealed her conviction. The state appellate court upheld it in 2017. The state's highest court declined to hear the case after that. As of today, she remains in a New York State prison. Her first parole eligibility will not come until she has served her full minimum of 20 years. The case of Lacy Spears became one of the most studied examples of how social media can interact with and intensify factitious disorder by proxy. Lacy had built an audience of strangers online who praised her for being a strong, devoted mother. The praise was the reward. To keep getting it, she needed Garnett to keep being sick. The salt was the way she made sure he stayed sick. The dose she finally gave him was either an attempt to push the illness further or a miscalculation. Either way, the boy who was famous for being sick on the internet was now dead because of the very thing that had made him famous in the first place. The internet posts she made continued, in some form, even after his death. She posted updates from the hospital while he was unconscious. She asked her followers for prayers. She accepted condolences. She did all of this while she was already a person of interest to investigators, while feeding bags filled with salt sat in her apartment, and while she was making the phone call asking her friend to dispose of the evidence. The performance of being a grieving mother was what she had been training for, through years of being the performance of a worried one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lacy Spears used the medical system itself as her cover. The doctors and nurses around her saw a devoted mother. The internet around her saw a saint. The next mother on this list did not bother with cover. She made no attempt to look like a sweet parent or a caring wife. She picked up a gun in her own house, fired it at her 4 sons, and left a note for the man she really wanted to hurt. The note said that he was about to lose everyone he had ever loved. Case 7. Susan Eubanks. In the small city of San Marcos, California, on a Sunday afternoon in October 1997, a 33-year-old woman named Susan Eubanks sat alone in her house with her 4 sons. She had been drinking for hours. She had just had a fight with her boyfriend that ended their relationship. She had been left for the 3rd or 4th time in her life by a man she had been counting on. Her 3 older sons had different fathers. Her 1 nephew, who she had been raising, was also in the house. She had a 5-shot revolver. Within the next few hours, she would use it to take the lives of all 4 of her boys, write 5 separate notes laying out exactly what she was doing and why, and then turn the gun on herself. The case became known in California as the San Marcos Massacre. It is one of the clearest cases on this list of a mother who used her own children as instruments of revenge against the men who had left her. The note she wrote to one of those men was found on her bedroom floor, in her own handwriting, just hours after the killings. The note said that she had lost everyone she had ever loved, and that now it was his turn to do the same. To understand how Susan Eubanks reached the morning of October 26, 1997, you have to go back through years of the same pattern repeating itself in her life. She had been married twice before that day. Her first husband was a man named John Armstrong. The 2 of them had 1 son together, Brandon, who was the oldest of the 4 boys in the house. After that marriage ended, Susan moved on to a man named Larry Shoebridge, who fathered her 2nd son, Austin. While she was still pregnant with Austin, she met and married a 3rd man, Eric Eubanks. Eric raised Austin as his own, and he and Susan had 2 more sons together. Those were Brigham and Matthew, the youngest 2 boys. The Eubanks marriage was rocky from the start. Susan drank heavily. She had been arrested in July 1996 for driving drunk, after almost colliding with a police car. Her blood alcohol level was 0.21, which is more than 2.5 times the legal limit in California. She was placed on probation, fined, and ordered to attend a victim impact panel run by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Her drinking did not stop. People who knew her said she would sometimes leave the 4 boys in the car in the parking lot of a local bar called North Bar, while she sat inside drinking for hours. The kids would come up to the door, looking for water. By September 1997, Susan filed for divorce from Eric Eubanks. He moved out of the house they shared in San Marcos. Susan immediately moved in a man named Rene Dodson, who she had been involved with on and off since 1994. Then a few weeks later, Dodson briefly left the house, and Eric came back. A short time after that, Eric left again, and Dodson came back. The men kept rotating in and out. The four boys watched all of it. They watched their mother go through a string of breakups and reunions while she drank and took prescription pills. Around 10 days before the killings, Susan walked into a hardware store in San Marcos and bought new deadbolt locks for her house. She told the clerk, who happened to know Renee Dodson personally, that Dodson had broken her old lock. She said she was changing the locks so he could not get back in. Then she said something that the clerk would later describe to the jury at her trial. She told the clerk to pass on a message to Dodson. She said she had just bought bullets at a nearby store, and one of them had his name on it. She turned to one of her young sons, who was standing next to her, and asked him to confirm that Mummy had bought the bullets. The little boy nodded. He confirmed it. That same week, Susan told a longtime friend of Dodson's, a woman named Debbie McNeil, the same thing. She said she had bought bullets, and one of them was meant for Dodson. When Debbie said she did not believe her, Susan made one of the boys, Austin, repeat the story so that Debbie would have to take it seriously. Austin was 7 years old. He had no idea, when he confirmed that the bullets had been bought, that one of those bullets was actually meant for him. The morning of Sunday, October 26, 1997, started with drinking. Susan and Renee Dodson drove to the North Bar in nearby Escondido. They sat there for hours, drinking and watching a Chargers football game. Susan was also taking Valium that day. By the afternoon, the two of them were arguing. Renee told Susan he was leaving her for good. He was moving out. The relationship was over. Susan stormed out of the bar in a rage. She drove home. She slashed 2 of Renee's tyres. She refused to let him into the house when he came back. Renee called the police. He asked 2 officers to escort him to the house so he could safely collect his belongings. While that was happening, Eric Eubanks, Susan's estranged husband, happened to stop by the house. Renee left with Eric in Eric's car. As they drove away together, Renee told Eric something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said Susan was acting unstable. He said she had been talking about ending her life and the lives of the boys. He said he was worried. Eric and Renee went back to the North Bar to keep drinking. A few hours later, while Eric was still at the bar, his pager buzzed. He had a voicemail. He played it. The message had been left by Susan. It was only 2 words long. The message said, "Say goodbye." Eric called 911 immediately. By the time deputies from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department got to the house in San Marcos, it was too late. They went inside. They found Brandon Armstrong, age 14, on the living room floor. He had been watching television. He had a half-eaten bowl of cereal nearby. His mother had walked up to him in the living room with the revolver and ended his life with shots fired at close range. They moved through the house. They came to a bedroom where the 3 younger boys had been together. Austin, age 7, was found on the top level of his bunk bed. He had been sitting up. Brigham, age 6, and Matthew, age 4, were on the bottom bunk. The 3 of them had been playing a Nintendo game just minutes earlier. Each of them had been shot in the head. The deputies kept moving through the house. They found Susan's nephew. He was 5 years old. He was unharmed. He had been hiding in a bedroom under the blankets, untouched. They found Susan herself nearby. She was conscious. She had shot herself in the abdomen. The wound was not life-threatening. Investigators noted at the scene that Susan, having just used the gun to take 4 lives with shots to the head, had clearly known how to use it lethally. The fact that she had aimed at her own stomach and not at her own head did not look to them like a serious suicide attempt. Prosecutors would later argue that she had shot herself in a place where she would survive on purpose, either to make her actions look like a desperate act she had not been able to follow through on, or to attract sympathy at her trial. When the deputies searched the house, they found something that turned the case from a horrible tragedy into a clearly premeditated multiple murder. On Susan's bedroom floor were 5 handwritten notes. Each one was addressed to a different person. Each one was in Susan's handwriting. Each one explained what she was about to do. The notes had been written while she was alone in the house with her sons, before she pulled out the gun. The first note was to Eric Eubanks. In it, she accused him of betraying her. She accused him of keeping a secret diary. She accused him and Renee Dodson of conspiring against her. Then came the line that has been quoted in nearly every report on the case. She wrote that she had lost everyone she had ever loved, and that it was now time for him to do the same. She told him he could use any money from her workers' disability case to bury the boys. The second note was to Renee Dodson. In that one she insulted him, called him a liar, told him to stay on his drug habit and move back in with his parents. The third note was to John Armstrong, Brandon's father. In that one, she wrote something even more chilling. She wrote that she knew he would hate her forever, but that she could not let Brandon live without his brothers, so she had done what she had done. She added that she had been strong for 25 years, and that she was tired of all the fighting and hurt. The notes laid the case bare. They did not show a woman in a moment of psychotic break. They showed a woman who had thought through who she wanted to hurt, and who had decided to use her 4 children as the way to hurt them. She had sat in her own bedroom, gathered paper, and written addresses on the notes. She had laid them out. Only then did she walk into the rest of the house and use the gun. Susan was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The case went to trial in San Diego County Superior Court in August 1999. The lead prosecutor argued that Susan had committed the killings because of rage, not despair. She had been left by men. She wanted to make those men suffer. The boys were the only weapon she had that would land. The defense tried to argue that Susan had been so impaired by alcohol and Valium that she could not form the intent needed for first-degree murder. They tried to portray her as a doting mother whose mind broke under the weight of her relationships. They argued she had been planning a murder-suicide and had not been able to finish the act. The jury did not buy it. The notes alone made the planning impossible to ignore. So did the bullets she had bought 10 days earlier and joked about with the hardware store clerk. So did the way she had told 2 separate people that she was going to do something terrible. So did the locks she had changed to keep Renee out. After deliberating for only about 2 hours, the jury found her guilty on all 4 counts. The verdict included the special circumstance allegation of multiple murders, which under California law made her eligible for the death penalty. The penalty phase took 2 more days. The same jury came back with a sentence of death. In October 1999, the trial judge upheld that verdict. Susan Eubanks was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where California houses its female death row inmates. Before her sentencing, she made a statement in court. She said she had loved her children. She said she had felt they would be better off dead. She framed the killings as a final act of love. The jury foreperson, speaking outside the courthouse after the death sentence was handed down, said something simple. The juror said it was a horrible thing to have to condemn somebody, but that in the end, Susan had condemned herself each time she pulled the trigger. Susan Eubanks remained on California's death row for 25 years. California, during that period, had the death penalty on the books, but rarely carried out actual executions. Multiple court challenges and a state-level moratorium on executions, signed by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2019, meant that no inmate sentenced to death was put to death during her time on death row. In 2024, after a long string of legal appeals from her defense team that argued her original trial attorney had been ineffective, the San Diego County District Attorney's Office reached an agreement to resolve all outstanding appeals at once. Under the deal, Susan Eubanks was resentenced. Her death sentence was changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The district attorney, Summer Stephan, made it clear in a public statement that the deal was guaranteed to keep her behind bars for the rest of her life. The death sentence had not been carried out, but neither would she ever be released. The house in San Marcos where the 4 boys lost their lives no longer exists. After the case, the property was eventually given over to local fire crews. He used it for a training exercise and burned it down. The graves of Austin, Brigham and Matthew sit together in a local cemetery, with their first initials marking the markers in order. Their oldest brother Brandon, who had a different father, is buried in Texas where his father lived. Eric Eubanks, the man who got the voicemail that night that said only the words, "say goodbye," has never spoken publicly about what happened. He did not show up in court for the verdict. He did not give interviews. He simply disappeared from the public side of the case and tried to live with what was left of his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Susan Eubanks left handwritten notes on her bedroom floor that explained in plain language what she had just done. She did not try to hide it. The next mother on this list did try to hide it. She invented a story that involved her boyfriend, a missing key, and an apartment full of confused witnesses. The thing she could not hide was the appliance in her kitchen, and what investigators were eventually able to prove had happened inside it. Case 8. China Arnold. In a housing complex in Dayton, Ohio, on the morning of August 30, 2005, a young mother carried her newborn daughter into the kitchen of her apartment. The baby was 28 days old. Her name was Paris Talley. She had been born on August 2nd of that same year. By the time the sun came up over Dayton on August 30th, Paris had been alive for less than a month. By the time the day ended, she would be dead, and the way she had died would become one of the most disturbing cases in the modern history of Ohio's court system. The mother was a 25-year-old woman named China Arnold. She had 3 older sons from previous relationships. Paris was her 4th child and her only daughter. She lived in the apartment with her boyfriend Theresa Talley, who was Paris's father, and her 3 boys. To people who knew her, she had seemed happy about having a baby girl. She had quit her job. She had stopped attending college. She had said she wanted to be home full-time so she could raise her daughter. The baby was 28 days old when she was brought into a hospital with no pulse and damage to her body that doctors had never seen on an infant before. The damage was internal. Her core body temperature had reached somewhere between 107 and 108 degrees Fahrenheit before she died. The doctors who examined her could not initially explain what had happened. There were no broken bones. There were no marks of any normal kind. The injuries did not match any known accident. It would take police investigators over a year of work to figure out what had killed Paris Talley. The answer, when they got it, did not match anything they had ever investigated before. Paris had been placed inside a microwave oven inside the family's apartment, and the microwave had been turned on for about 2 minutes. The damage to her tiny body was the kind of damage that comes from intense internal heat. There were no external burns visible because microwave radiation cooks tissue from the inside out. The baby had not survived more than seconds. By the time her mother removed her from the oven and put her on the kitchen table, she was already gone. To understand how this case unfolded, you have to look at the night before. On August 29, 2005, China Arnold and Theresa Talley were at a local park together. They were arguing. The argument was about Paris's paternity. Talley had been hearing rumours that China had been unfaithful during her pregnancy. He was now openly questioning whether the 28-day-old baby was actually his. He kept pushing the question. China kept pushing back. The fight got worse. By the time they returned to the apartment between 9 and 10 in the evening, the argument was physical. Talley threatened to leave her. According to the timeline that prosecutors later established, China continued drinking heavily that night. She was, by her own account, deeply intoxicated. She had been drinking high-proof rum. In the early hours of August 30th, around 2:30 in the morning, Paris started crying. China had been holding the baby on her chest while half asleep on the couch in the living room. She got up, heated a bottle, fed the baby, and changed her. Then, at some point in the next half hour, the situation in the apartment changed. The exact sequence of what China did next has been the subject of 3 separate trials. What the courts eventually ruled, after years of legal arguments, is that she carried Paris into the kitchen. She placed her in the microwave oven. She closed the door. She set a timer. She started it. She left the room while the appliance ran for about 2 minutes. The first time the world heard about the case, China Arnold was telling a different story. When she brought her daughter to the hospital later on August 30th, she said the baby had felt warm during the night. She said she had been sleeping with Paris on her chest. She told doctors and police that around 2:30 in the morning, Paris had been crying, that she had fed her and put her down, and that she had not woken up properly in the morning. She said the baby had felt feverish. The doctors who examined Paris that day pronounced her dead. They were confused by what they were seeing. The official investigation began. China was questioned. She was released. There was not enough evidence at that point to charge her with anything. The case sat for over a year while the investigation went on quietly. Detectives interviewed neighbours. They interviewed family members. They tried to figure out how an infant could have died with internal heat damage, but no external injuries. The medical examiner's office in Montgomery County, Ohio, finally concluded that the only mechanism that fit was microwave radiation. Once that conclusion was reached, the only question was, who had put Paris into the microwave? There were only 2 adults in the apartment that night, and only one of them had been alone with the baby in the relevant window. That person was China Arnold. In November 2006, she was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. Her 3 sons were taken into the care of family members. The case went through 3 separate trials. The first trial began in late January 2008 in the Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas. The lead prosecutor was Assistant County Prosecutor Dan Brandt. The defense was led by attorney John Paul Rion. The prosecution's case rested on 3 things. The first was the medical evidence about how Paris had died. The second was the fact that China had been the only adult alone with the baby during the time when the death had occurred. The third was a witness named Linda Williams, who had been China's cellmate at the Montgomery County Jail. Linda Williams testified that during the time she shared a cell with China, the 2 of them had become close. China had told her, in detail, what had happened to Paris. According to Williams, China had described placing the baby into the microwave because of the fight with Terrell Talley over Paris's paternity. Williams told the jury that China had used a phrase about how the baby fit in the oven. She told the jury that China was afraid Talley was going to leave her if he believed the baby was not his. The first trial was about to end when something unexpected happened. Just before closing arguments, Talley came forward and said that his son, who had been a young child at the time of Paris's death, had told him a different story. According to Talley, the boy had said that another child, a young neighbour's son, had been the one to put Paris in the microwave. An 8-year-old neighbour was brought in to testify privately to the judge. He said he had seen another boy place Paris in the appliance. The story did not hold together when investigators looked at it. The mother of the 8-year-old and others who had been in the area said the children had not even been present at China's apartment that day. But the late introduction of the story was enough to throw the trial off track. The judge declared a mistrial. The second trial took place later in 2008. By then, the prosecution had additional witnesses lined up. The mother of the child who had supposedly seen another boy do it took the stand and confirmed that her family had not been in the apartment when Paris died. The story that the defense had used to derail the first trial fell apart in front of the jury. On September 8, 2008, a jury convicted China Arnold of aggravated murder. The judge, Mary Wiseman, rejected the death penalty option that the prosecution had originally been seeking. Instead, she sentenced China to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That should have been the end of the case. It was not. In November 2010, the Ohio 2nd District Court of Appeals reversed the conviction. The appeals court found 2 main problems with the second trial. The first problem was that Linda Williams, the jailhouse witness who had been so central to the prosecution's case in the first trial, had failed to appear in person at the second trial. She had vanished. Investigators had searched for her at multiple addresses and could not find her. The trial court had allowed the prosecution to play a videotape of her testimony from the first trial instead. The appeals court ruled this had been improper. The second problem was that Williams had, at one point after the first trial, told another woman named Kyra Woods that she had lied about the confession. Kyra Woods was prepared to testify about this, but the trial court had not allowed her to. The appeals court said that should have been allowed. The conviction was overturned. China was given a new trial. The third trial began in 2011. By this point, 6 years had passed since Paris had died. The prosecution faced a real challenge. Williams was still missing. Her credibility had been shaken by the question of whether she had told another inmate she had lied. The defense was determined to argue that the case had always been weak, and that the actual evidence pointed at least as much at Talley as it did at China. The defense team brought in a pharmacist named Robert Bellotto, who testified that China had been so deeply intoxicated on the night in question that, in his medical opinion, she would not have been physically capable of placing a baby in a microwave and operating it. The defense also raised again the question of whether she had been alone in the apartment for as long as the prosecution claimed. Prosecutor Dan Brandt rebuilt the case for the new jury. He told them the truth was simple. Only China had been alone with the baby. She had told other inmates, in the years since her arrest, what she had done. She had told the police herself, in earlier interviews, that the death never would have happened if she had not been so drunk. He pointed out that being intoxicated does not erase the act of carrying a baby across a room, opening the appliance door, placing the baby inside, closing the door, setting a timer, and pressing the start button. He argued that those steps are not accidents. They are choices. They take time. They take physical action. He told the jury that whatever China's mental state had been, she had taken those steps in a sequence, and the sequence amounted to an intentional act. On May 13, 2011, after years of legal battles and 3 trials, a jury once again found China Arnold guilty of aggravated murder. Brandt told the jury during closing arguments that her actions had been more purposeful than killing somebody with a gun or a knife, because she had needed to physically place a baby into a confined space, close it, set a timer, and walk away while the appliance ran. He said if that was not purposeful, he did not know what was. The jury agreed. The death penalty was rejected again by both the jury and the judge. On May 20th, 2011, China Arnold was again sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Mary Wiseman, who handed down the sentence, told the courtroom that no adjectives existed to adequately describe what had happened to Paris. She said the act was shocking and abhorrent in a civilized society. China was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She had asked to watch from a side room. Her defense team announced an appeal almost immediately. They argued that errors had been made in the 3rd trial. In December 2013, the Ohio 2nd District Court of Appeals heard the appeal and rejected it. They affirmed her conviction. Her lawyers tried again, this time at the Ohio Supreme Court, raising constitutional questions about double jeopardy because of the multiple trials. In May 2014, the Ohio Supreme Court declined to take up the appeal. With that, the case was effectively over. China Arnold's life sentence stood. China Arnold was incarcerated at the Dayton Correctional Institution. She has continued to maintain her innocence in the years since. Her family has continued to push for new evidence to come forward. The defense's argument that the case was unfair because of issues with Linda Williams has remained a part of the public discussion of the case, but the conviction has not been disturbed. 3 different juries heard versions of the case. 2 of them convicted her. The one trial that did not end in conviction was thrown out for procedural reasons, rather than because the jury believed she was innocent. What made China Arnold's case stand out, beyond the unique nature of how Paris died, was a small detail in her own statements that prosecutors kept returning to. China had told police early in the case that the death would not have happened if she had not been drunk. She had not said it would not have happened if she were a different kind of person. She had not said she did not know how it had happened. She had said the alcohol was the variable that had let it happen. That admission, which she had given before she had a lawyer, was used against her in all 3 trials. It was a small sentence. It carried a heavy weight. China Arnold's case is, in the modern history of American filicide cases, an outlier in the simple sense that the method she used had only been seen in one other case in the entire country. That earlier case, in Virginia in 1999, had been ruled an accident caused by an epileptic seizure. China's case was ruled, after 3 trials, to be no accident. Paris Talley was 28 days old. She lived for less than a month. She would have been 19 years old in 2024 if she had been allowed to grow up. She did not get to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. China Arnold ended one life because of a fight with her boyfriend over paternity. The next mother on this list did not act in a moment of drunken rage. She decided she could no longer carry the weight of being a single mother of 6 children. Then, one by one, she called each of those children into the apartment, in order from oldest to youngest, and made sure none of them would walk back out. Case 9. Kua Her. In the early evening of Thursday, September 3rd, 1998, a 911 dispatcher in St. Paul, Minnesota, picked up a call from a woman speaking through tears. The woman said she was about to take her own life. The address came up on the screen as 1541 Timberlake Road in the McDonough Homes public housing complex on the city's east side. It was a row of beige stucco townhomes that housed mostly Southeast Asian refugee families. As the dispatcher kept the woman on the line, the call shifted. The woman now said something different. She said she had killed her children. The dispatcher passed that information along to the officers, who were already racing to the scene. By 7:17 in the evening, 2 officers had pulled the screen door off its hinges, kicked the front door, forced their way inside, and walked into the worst scene any of them had seen in their careers. Inside the apartment were 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 5. Each one had a piece of black cloth tied around the neck. They were spread throughout the home in different rooms. They had been called inside from the yard, one at a time, in order from the oldest to the youngest, and each one had been ended in a different part of the house before the next one was brought in. Their mother, a 24-year-old woman named Kua Her, was lying near the front door wearing a red ceremonial dress. She had an electrical extension cord loosely tied around her own neck. She was alive. She had not finished what she had said, on the phone, she was going to do. The names of the children were Kua Her, who was 11, Samson, who was 9, Nali, who was 9, Tang Lung, who was 7, A, who was 6, Tang K, who was 5. They had 3 different ages between them, but only a 6-year gap from oldest to youngest. Their mother had been having children almost without a pause since she was 13 years old. To understand how a 24-year-old woman ended up in a row house in St. Paul with 6 dead children in the rooms behind her, you have to start in a refugee camp in Thailand. Kua Her was Hmong. The Hmong are an ethnic group from the highlands of Laos who fought alongside American forces during the Vietnam War. After the war ended, many Hmong fled into Thailand to escape revenge from the new Laotian government. They lived in refugee camps for years. Kua was born in Laos in 1973. Her family ended up in one of those camps. She married a man named Tu Hang in an arranged marriage when she was 12 years old. He was 5 years older than her. By the time she was 13, she had her first child. She had all 6 of her children by the time she was 20. The Hang family came to the United States in the 1980s. They settled in Minnesota, which at the time was becoming home to the largest Hmong population in the country. They moved into McDonough Homes in 1990. The complex was where many Hmong families spent their first years in America. About 62% of the people who lived there at the time were Southeast Asian. The walls were thin. The neighbours knew each other's business. Anything that happened inside one apartment was usually noticed by the people in the apartments next door. The family next door to the Hangs and the families across the courtyard had been hearing problems from inside their unit for years. The marriage between Kua and To was failing. The two of them fought constantly. The fights got physical. Police were called to the apartment, by various neighbours and by the couple themselves, at least 16 times in the 2 years before the killings. To said Kua had once pulled a gun on him. Kua said To had been violent with her. Both of those things may have been true. By 1998, they were separated. To had moved out. Kua was raising the 6 children alone in the housing complex, on a low income, with very little extended family nearby to help. She was struggling in ways that everyone around her could see. The children were sometimes left alone in the apartment. Police had been called more than once just to check on them. The local community outreach program officers, who worked specifically inside the housing complex, had been to the apartment many times. Officer Jim Chafee, who was one of the first responders that September evening, had been inside the home before. He had gotten to know the oldest boy, 11-year-old Kua Her, fairly well. Kua Her was the spokesperson for his siblings. He looked after them. He answered the door when the officers came. He explained things in English when his mother could not. About a week before the killings, Tu Hang had stopped by the apartment to drop off food. Nobody had answered the door. Chafee had come over and found the children hiding inside. Kua Her had told Chafee that his mother had instructed him not to open the door for his father, that his father was not their father anymore, that they were not allowed to talk to him. The pressures on Kua Her in the late summer of 1998 were piled on top of each other. She was a single mother of 6. She had no job that paid enough to support that many kids. Her marriage had collapsed. In Hmong culture at the time, a divorced woman was often shunned, pushed to the edges of the community. Other women would sometimes refuse to be friends with her. People assumed the marriage had failed because of her. She was also dealing with the long shadow of having been a child bride, of having had her first baby at 13, of having spent her teenage years pregnant or caring for newborns instead of going to school. Her father said she had a very short temper. Her mother-in-law said that for the entire first year of her oldest son's life, Kua had refused to even hold him, and that the grandmother had ended up doing most of the early caregiving. The afternoon of September 3rd, 1998 began with the children playing outside the apartment. It was a normal late summer afternoon. School was about to start. Some of the kids would have been starting new grades the next week. Kua Her was inside. At some point, she made her decision. She would take her own life. Before she did, she decided she could not leave the children behind. According to what she would later tell police and her own attorney, she believed that as a Christian convert, she could send the children directly to heaven, and that this would be a more responsible end than leaving them as orphans of a single mother who had ended her own life. The killings happened in sequence. She called Kua AI inside first. He was 11, the oldest. He came in. She used a piece of black cloth. Then she called Samson, who was 9. Then Nali, who was also 9. Then Tanglun, who was 7. Then A, who was 6. Then Tangke, the youngest, who was 5. Each child was ended in a different room of the apartment. Each one had no idea what had happened to the brothers and sisters who had gone inside before. The medical examiner later determined that all 6 children had been strangled. After the last child was finished, Kua Her tried to do the same thing to herself with an electrical cord. She failed. She made the 911 call. She told the dispatcher she was about to end her own life. Then she said, mid-call, that she had killed her children. Officers Chaffee and Robert Larson, who had been working in the housing complex for years, were the first ones inside. Chaffee said later that what he saw that day was something he could never unsee. When he went home that night, he checked on his own 2 young children. Every time he opened a bedroom door, he thought he saw a black cord around their necks. He looked again. There was nothing there. He slept maybe 45 minutes total that night, in 5-minute pieces. Kua Her was taken to Regents Hospital. The cord around her own neck was loose. She had not seriously injured herself. She was treated, then arrested. She was charged with 6 counts of intentional second-degree murder. Her bail was set at $1 million. She underwent a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, which found her competent to stand trial. Her court-appointed attorney was Bruce Wenger, a public defender. The Ramsey County prosecutor was Chris Wilton. The case did not go to a full trial. Wenger considered raising a defense based on mental illness. He believed his client did not understand at the time that what she was doing was wrong, because in her mind, she had been performing an act of love. He also knew the risks. If a jury did not buy that defense, she would face 6 consecutive life sentences. The prosecution offered a plea deal. If she pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of second-degree murder, she would receive a 50-year sentence and would be eligible for parole consideration after 33 years. On December 1st, 1998, just 3 months after the killings, Kua Her stood in a Ramsey County courtroom in front of District Judge Charles A. Flynn and changed her plea. Through a Hmong interpreter, she answered the prosecutor's questions about what had happened. When asked to describe what she had done to her children on September 3rd, she answered in plain words. She said she had strangled their necks. She received 2 consecutive 25-year sentences for the first 2 children, Kua Ei and Samson. The other 4 sentences ran concurrently with those. She was sent to the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, the state's main women's prison. She has been there ever since. The funeral for the 6 children took place over 4 days. Hundreds of people attended. The Hmong community in St. Paul, which at the time made up about 1 in every 10 residents of the city, gathered for traditional ceremonies. The children were buried side by side at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Maplewood, Minnesota, on Lot 134, Block 33. Their mother did not attend the funeral. For 10 years, the gravesite had no headstones. There was nothing on the surface of the ground to mark who lay underneath. People walked over the burial plot without knowing what was there. Eventually, after a local newspaper column drew attention to the issue, the community began discussions about marking the graves properly. The Hmong tradition strongly favours marked memorials, and the absence of any marker on 6 children's graves was felt as a wound. The case forced changes in how the Hmong community in Minnesota addressed mental health. A group called the Hmong Mental Health Providers Network was formed in the years after the killings. New programs were created at St. Paul Ramsey County Public Health to specifically reach Hmong families. People began talking openly about depression, domestic violence, and the pressures faced by women who had been married as children and had spent their early adulthood having babies. May Kao Hang, who later became the head of a major Minnesota foundation, said something at the time that captured what many people were feeling. She said, "By the time a tragedy like this happens, a lot of warning signals have already been sent to people who could have helped, and all of those people have failed." She said the children should not have died, and the mother should have gotten the support she needed before any of it ever started. Kua Her remains incarcerated. Under her plea deal, she became eligible for first parole consideration after 33 years served, which would put her first review in 2031. Her current expected release date sits in 2032. By that time, she will be in her late 50s. Whether she is ever released will depend on her behaviour in custody and the recommendations of the Minnesota board that handles such cases. The apartment where the killings happened was eventually converted into a police outreach office and then later returned to use as a rental home for new families. The address still exists. The walls have been painted. The floors have been replaced. People live there now who may not know what happened in their living room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kua Her killed all 6 of her children inside her own apartment in a single afternoon. She did it because she believed she was running out of options. The next mother on this list also targeted her own children, but she did not act in a single moment of breakdown. She built her crimes over years of escalating cruelty inside the home, used her surviving children to help cover up what she had done, and might never have been caught if her youngest daughter had not seen a true crime show on television and recognized her own dead sister. Case 10. Theresa Knorr. In the fall of 1993, a young woman in Sandy, Utah sat down in front of her television to watch a Sunday night episode of America's Most Wanted. She was 23 years old. She worked as a grocery store cashier. She had been living quietly for years under a borrowed identity. She watched the show because she liked the cases. That night, the show featured a story about a body that had been found nearly a decade earlier in the high country near Lake Tahoe, California. The remains had never been identified. The young woman watching the show stared at the artist's sketch on the screen. She knew exactly who the unidentified body was. The sketch was of her own older sister, who had been dead since 1984. The young woman's name was Terry Knorr. The dead sister was Susan Knorr. The person who had ended Susan's life and the life of another sister the year after was their mother. Terry picked up the phone and called the show's hotline. By doing that, she set in motion an investigation that would finally bring one of the most disturbing cases in California history into the open, after almost a decade of silence. The mother at the center of the case was Theresa Jimmy Francine Knorr. She was born in Sacramento, California, on March 14, 1946. Her childhood was difficult. Her father had Parkinson's disease and took his frustration out on the family. Her mother died of a heart attack in 1961 when Theresa was almost 15 years old. She held her mother in her arms as it happened. By 17, she was married to a man named Clifford Sanders. The marriage did not last. In July 1964, during an argument, Theresa shot Clifford with a rifle. She was charged with murder. She claimed self-defense. She was pregnant during the trial. On September 22, 1964, a jury found her not guilty. The acquittal would later become important to the way investigators looked at her, because it showed that even in the early years of her adult life, she had already ended one life and walked away. She married a United States Marine named Robert Knorr in 1966. They had 4 children together. Combined with the 2 she already had, that gave her 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. The children were Howard, Sheila Gay, Susan Marlene, William, Robert Jr., and Terry, born across a span from 1963 to 1970. The marriage to Robert Knorr did not last. Theresa went through 2 more marriages after that, the last one ending in 1976. After that final divorce, the people who knew her say something inside her broke. Her behaviour toward her children, which had always been controlling, turned into something far worse. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Theresa Knorr had moved her family from Orangevale, California, to a 2-bedroom apartment in Sacramento. The eldest son, Howard, had already left home and stayed away. The other 5 children lived with their mother. Neighbours saw very little of them. The children were not allowed outside. They were not allowed to have visitors. They were not allowed to use the phone freely. Their mother had disconnected the home phone line. Theresa drank heavily. She had gained a great deal of weight. She had become reclusive. She had developed strange beliefs, including a belief that her 4th ex-husband had used some kind of magic to turn her daughter Susan against her. The household became, by every account from the surviving children later given to police, a place where the rest of the world simply did not exist. There was only their mother, only her rules, and only her changing moods. The home life was dominated by abuse. Theresa primarily targeted her 2 oldest daughters, Susan and Sheila. She believed they were becoming too attractive while she was getting older. The youngest daughter, Terry, who was small and quiet, was hurt less, but lived in constant fear. The 2 sons, William and Robert Jr., were forced into a horrible position. Their mother demanded they participate. They were teenagers. They were trapped in the same household. They obeyed her out of fear. The cycle would continue for years. In 1982, the situation moved past abuse into something even worse. Theresa became convinced Susan was casting spells on her to make her gain weight. During an argument in 1983, Theresa shot Susan in the chest with a small caliber gun. The bullet went in. Susan did not die. She was paralysed from the waist down for a period. She survived the initial wound. Theresa did not take her to a hospital. She did not call for help. She kept Susan in the apartment. The bullet stayed inside Susan's body. Over time, Susan slowly recovered the use of her legs, but the bullet remained. In July 1984, Susan, then 17, made a deal with her mother. She wanted to leave home. Theresa agreed she could leave on one condition. The bullet had to come out first, because the bullet was evidence. There would be no doctor. The operation would happen on the kitchen table of the apartment at the hands of family members. The procedure was done. Susan survived the surgery itself but developed a serious infection. She became feverish. She was clearly dying. Theresa decided she did not want Susan to die in the apartment, where the body would have to be explained. She had her sons help her carry Susan out to a vehicle. They drove for hours up Highway 89 toward the Lake Tahoe area. They stopped along the road. Susan's life ended near Squaw Valley, California, on July 17, 1984. She was 17 years old. Susan's body was found later by hikers. There was no identification on the remains. The Placer County authorities had no way to figure out who she was. The case sat as an unidentified Jane Doe in the cold case files for nearly a decade. The Knorr family, meanwhile, went on as if nothing had happened. Theresa told the other children that Susan had run away. The lie sat in the household like a shadow. Less than a year later, Theresa turned her focus on her oldest daughter Sheila, who was now 20. In May 1985, she forced Sheila to bring in money for the family. Sheila handed over the money. After a few weeks, Theresa decided that Sheila had given her some kind of disease through a toilet seat. Sheila denied it. Theresa beat her, hogtied her, and locked her inside a small closet in the apartment. Sheila was kept in that closet without food and without water. The other children were forbidden to open the door. The youngest daughter, Terry, who was 14 at the time, sneaked Sheila a beer through the door at one point. It was the only thing Sheila received. Sheila died inside the closet. Her body was placed in a box and was driven up to a wooded area near Martis Creek campground near Truckee. It was left there. Like Susan's, it was eventually found and went unidentified for years. After Sheila's death, the family moved out of the Sacramento apartment. The smell of decomposition had become impossible to ignore. According to later accounts from Terry, her mother forced her to start a fire in the apartment to destroy any remaining physical evidence. The family scattered. Howard, the oldest son, had been gone for years already. William and Terry escaped at various points. Terry, then 16, used Sheila's identification card to pass herself off as an adult and disappeared. Robert Jr., 19 at the time, stayed with his mother. He moved with her to Las Vegas and tried to keep a low profile. In November 1991, Robert Jr. was arrested for fatally shooting a bartender during an attempted robbery. He was sentenced to 16 years in a Nevada prison. Theresa, now alone for the first time in her adult life, left Las Vegas and moved to Salt Lake City. She took a job as a nurse's aide. She lived under a quieter version of her own name. She believed she had escaped any consequences for what she had done. Terry had spent the years after escaping trying to make people listen. She had reported the murders to police in Utah. They had not believed her. She had told a therapist. The therapist had treated her account as a fantasy. She had no proof. The bodies of Susan and Sheila were unknown Jane Does in different California counties, and Terry had no way to connect them to her story. Then, on October 28, 1993, while watching America's Most Wanted, she saw the artist's reconstruction of the Tahoe Jane Doe. She recognized her sister immediately. She called the show. They told her to call the Placer County Sheriff's Department in California. This time, she found someone who took her seriously. The Placer County investigators began comparing her account to the cold case files. The details Terry gave them about her sister Susan matched the unidentified body found in 1984. They contacted Sacramento County and connected the Jane Doe found near Truckee in 1985 to her description of Sheila. They contacted Terry's surviving brothers, William and his sister Jessica. William, who had been forced as a teenager to participate, had been carrying the secret for nearly a decade. Once Terry had broken the silence, he told investigators what he had seen. He told them what his mother had ordered him to do. He told them where Sheila had been left. The fingerprints on the box where Sheila's body had been found were eventually matched to Theresa's son's. The story, for the first time, was complete. In November 1993, Theresa Knorr was located in Salt Lake City, where she had been preparing to flee further. Police arrested her on November 10th. She was extradited to California. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 special circumstance allegations, which included multiple murder and murder by torture. The special circumstances meant the prosecution could seek the death penalty. Theresa initially pleaded not guilty. As the case moved toward trial, her defense team realized they had a significant problem. Her 2 sons were both willing to testify against her. William, who had received an immunity arrangement in exchange for his cooperation, was prepared to describe everything he had seen. Robert Jr., already serving a long sentence in Nevada, had also agreed to talk. Their accounts matched each other and matched Terry's account. Faced with that, Theresa changed her plea. In October 1995, she accepted a plea agreement that took the death penalty off the table in exchange for guilty pleas on the 2 murder counts. On October 17, 1995, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. She was sent to the California Institution for Women in Chino, California. The sons received different outcomes. William, because he had been a teenager when the events happened and had cooperated with authorities, received probation and was ordered into therapy. Robert Jr., who had been older at the time and was already a convicted killer in Nevada, pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact in Sheila's death. He received 3 additional years to be served alongside his Nevada sentence. Theresa Knorr has been in prison since 1995. She was first considered for parole in the 2000s and has been denied each time it has come up. Her most recent denial was in 2019. The next hearing was scheduled for the mid-2020s. The state of California has indicated repeatedly that they do not believe she is fit to be released. She is now in her late 70s. The youngest daughter, Terry, the one who had finally broken the silence by calling America's Most Wanted, never fully recovered from the years inside her mother's home. She married twice. She tried to live a quiet life in Sandy, Utah. She struggled with her health. She died of a heart attack in 2011 at the age of 41. She had spent the last years of her life trying to make sure her sisters' deaths were known and remembered. She had succeeded in that, but the cost to her own life had been extreme. The two surviving brothers each carried their own version of the same weight. William had been forced as a child to help his mother do unforgivable things. He spent years afterward in therapy, trying to live with that. The Knorr case is studied today in criminology and family violence courses. It is the case people point to when they want to explain how an isolated household can hide horrific events for years, how children can be turned into participants by an abusive parent, and how survivors of severe family abuse may carry the weight long after the abuser is in prison. It is also the case that shows how easily such crimes can stay hidden when the children inside the home have nobody to turn to. Two of Theresa Knorr's daughters were dead for nearly a decade before anyone in law enforcement even knew their names. Their mother had counted on that. She nearly got away with it. She did not in the end, only because her youngest daughter happened to turn on her television one Sunday night in October 1993 and saw her sister's face on the screen. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.